This Lent, we're exploring who killed Jesus.
Many people are convinced that they know the answer.
But we've gathered 16 suspects as we retrace the events of Holy Week in the special 6-week podcast.
With your help, we'll discover who really killed Jesus.
This podcast is a production of progressivechristianity.org
and University Christian Church, San Diego.
I'm Caleb Lyons.
And I'm Marshela Salgado.
This is Who Killed Jesus, a true crime podcast, Episode 5, Good Friday. Welcome back to Who Killed Jesus, where today we have finally reached Good Friday, the day where Jesus was murdered by crucifixion. But let's take a look really quickly at how we got here. And I think if we look at each day, we can see why Good Friday was ultimately inevitable. So on Palm Sunday, Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and he and his followers stage an anti-imperial protest against Pontius Pilate. On Monday, Jesus goes into the temple, and he overturns the money changers' table and issues this indictment, this counter-protest against the religious establishment. On Teaching Tuesday, Jesus goes back to the temple, and he teaches out in the courtyard, but again teaches against the religious establishment and the purity system. On Women's Wednesday, Jesus is anointed as king by a woman in the home of someone who was seen as ritually impure. It is at that point that Judas decides to betray Jesus. And then on Maundy Thursday, Jesus has a last meal with his disciples and is betrayed by Judas and is ultimately cornered in the Garden of Gethsemane. So when you look at the events like that, it seems pretty inevitable that arrest and execution happened. Jesus stood up against empire, and he stood up against the religious establishment. So Marshela, we have a good list of suspects so far.
That we do, yeah. So we can begin with the Roman Empire. And with that, we have Emperor Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas, who was a Jewish high priest, as well as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, U.S. politics, Judas, and with Judas, that I think could also include greed and fear. We also have Jesus's disciples, which is not something you hear very often, and the Sanhedrin Council, basically. So
okay, that's a good list of suspects that we've talked about so far.
Yeah, yep. And they were names that came up before we started reading the book, and they have all popped up. Well, minus U.S. politics, but we can make comparisons there.
That's right. And we've talked about Courtney Love.
And Courtney Love.
but she has not popped up in the story.
She has not popped up. We're just trying to keep her relevant. Reopen that case on who killed Kurt Cobain.
That's right. So other than Courtney Love, do you have any favorite suspects?
I did have Caiaphas was kind of, but he's kind of waned a little bit. I think the Roman Empire, and after seeing what happened on Teaching Tuesday, the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Yeah. One thing, Marshela, that really I've realized anew as we've been talking about this and going through the events of this day by day is how much all of these forces were all a part of Jesus's last week and what eventually led to Good Friday in a way that I don't think I really spent as much time with as I could have, recognizing that, wow, actually there was a lot involved here.
A lot involved, and it's so interwoven. You can't, at the time you couldn't separate, even like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the high priests, like all of these, and with the Roman Empire, they're all kind of interlocked and worked together in some ways, like the system that dominated the time too, like how it worked. There was no separation. Really.
No separation, and that they collaborated together in ways that if we didn't have some historical knowledge of what happened, we might not really understand the way that the domination system worked and the way that religious leaders and political leaders were not really at odds with each other at all, but were really
Right.
collaborators.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's where it brings in US politics too, because
Mm-hmm.
I think we see a lot of that, especially currently with stuff
Yeah.
that's happening with
Oh,
certain
yeah.
legislation.
Yeah.
Who's driving that legislation? And it's
Yeah.
not, it's not the same way, but very similar. Very similar.
It is. I mean, the religious right intentionally manipulated U.S. politics to get certain ideals
Mhm.
legislated as laws.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about reproductive rights,
Yeah.
the stripping away of
Yep.
reproductive rights. I think about the taking away of political or voting rights, and
Mhm.
whether or not it is the religious right who is using U.S. politics, or whether it's U.S. politicians who want to stay in power who are using the religious right, I think
Mhm.
is dynamic,
Right. Yeah. Yep.
depending on what point in time we're talking about. But I agree. I think that very much we can see parallels today
Mhm.
to the religious establishment, political establishment of Jesus's day
Yeah,
as well.
definitely.
So today's Good Friday that
Yay.
we're talking about, and that's kind of an odd name.
I know what's so good about a Friday where somebody is executed,
Yeah.
particularly
Mm.
Jesus, the person that we choose to follow. What is so good about it?
And I think that's something that always kind of struck me as odd once I really thought about it. I think a
Mhm.
lot of us just kind of go about Good Friday and are like, well, it's Good Friday. But I remember a sermon from when I was in seminary, and a professor who was preaching and stood up and said, "Why do they call it Good Friday?" And he had kind of a voice like that.
I love that.
What was so very good about
That's what I
it?
ask.
And ultimately, he resolved that it's good because of the redemption that people experienced. And I think that that's what Christian theology has ultimately
Mm,
said, that it's God's Friday or Good Friday because of redemption. But I think that's something that we'll talk about as
right.
we explore what actually happened and what
Mhm.
it might have meant. So, Good Friday, did you have any special way that you celebrated that as you were growing up? Did you observe Good Friday?
Yes, we did oftentimes. Sometimes schools wouldn't, school would close for the day.
Mhm,
Very much, just we lived in a very Christian community for the
mhm,
most part. Um, but I remember going to church sometimes I couldn't tell you what we did at church at the time when I was younger, but I do remember my very first service in college where it went on for hours, and it was the
uh,
7 final, wait, is it 7?
yeah, the
Yeah,
7
the
last
7
sayings,
last
yeah,
sayings,
yeah,
and there were sermons after
yeah.
each one, and these were not short Caleb sermons. I mean, and even that would be a lot because 'cause it'd be
That'd be a
like
lot.
70 minutes of
Yeah,
sermons or like, 80 something. But, some of them were very, very long,
yeah,
but it was my very first time that I went to one of those services. It was very moving, like, listening to the words, the
yeah,
final words. Um, Usually a very solemn day when it came to church,
yeah.
but that's also when we would do, like, Easter egg hunts and stuff,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
looking forward to there was no school, so we'd go to an Easter egg hunt or something, but yeah, how about
Yeah.
you?
I don't think I really grew up celebrating it much. I think my congregation had like an ecumenical service, but I was in school. We didn't get out for Good
Mhm.
Friday often, and so I didn't really observe it. I remember one of my first times observing Good Friday was a very similar service. So it
4
was,
hours later. No.
well, mine was 3
Oh, there you go.
hours, and it was Episcopalian, so the sermons weren't real long, but it was intentionally 3 hours, and it was supposed to represent the 3 hours that Jesus hung on the cross in the
Mhm.
Gospel of John. So
Right.
noon to 3, and after each of the 7 last sayings, we had a sermon, and actually the sermon I was just talking about,
Mhm.
why exactly is it Good Friday? Was at that service, and it was a very meaningful thing to do one time.
Exactly.
I'm not sure that I would want to be doing that every
Yes.
year.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
As is everything that happens on Good Friday. There
It is
is
a
a
lot.
lot.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of baggage that a lot of us bring to Good Friday.
Indeed. Indeed. Because I
Mm,
still cannot wrap my head around, when I like what's so good about Friday, and people say, well, it's good because my Savior died for me.
mhm.
I don't, there's, somebody dying for me, even if they had to, what's so good about that? Like, I just don't see
Mhm.
the goodness in it. So yeah, there is some stuff there, some baggage.
There's a lot of baggage that we need to just unpack and lay on out on the table today. So
Good.
let's take a quick break and let's come back and let's get into the baggage around Good
Yay.
Friday.
Who Killed Jesus, a true crime podcast, is a special 6-week exploration of who really killed Jesus and why.
This podcast is brought to you by ProgressiveChristianity.org, celebrating 30 years of reclaiming Jesus' original message of justice, peace, and liberation while proclaiming an intellectually honest Christianity.
And University Christian Church, San Diego, an authentic, inclusive, and progressive congregation in the heart of San Diego's Hillcrest neighborhood that declares God's love for all people.
Welcome back to Who Killed Jesus, and we are getting into the events of Good Friday. In the Gospel of Mark, our earliest gospel that we have in the New Testament, and I do think that's important, Marcella, because we've got 4 different gospels with 4 different accounts and 4 different theological
Yeah.
explanations of what happened. And even though Mark is first and Matthew and Luke both use Mark, Matthew and Luke also give us some different interpretations
Yeah.
of what's happening and why and what it means.
Yeah.
And then John does his own thing, as John always does.
Exactly.
So I think it's significant to say that we are following the Gospel of Mark and that Mark breaks this down into 3-hour intervals. So this
Right.
starts at 6 in the morning. Jesus is arrested in the night on Thursday and brought to the council, the Sanhedrin, one of our suspects. And they then take Jesus to Pontius Pilate.
Right.
And Pontius Pilate is most likely in Herod the Great's palace. And
Yeah, so he doesn't usually live there,
right.
right? Okay. Yeah, so that was interesting, and that was something a detail I'd never thought about or even.
That's a good point. Yeah, he lives in Caesarea Maritima. And so he comes into Jerusalem for the Passover celebration and for other religious festivals. But right now, that's why he's here. He's here for the Passover celebration. And that's a pilgrimage festival. That means that everyone's supposed to come to Jerusalem. And so it's packed with people who are talking all about God liberating them from empire. And so Pontius Pilate is there, and he's staying in this great palace that Herod built because Herod the Great, this is not the Herod that's in charge right now when Jesus is in his public ministry, but the Herod from the birth narratives. He built all these great things, and of course, the Roman governor wants to stay in the
Right.
opulent palace.
Right.
And so this incident takes place probably in the palace courtyard. And so we see the chief priests and the scribes, the elders, the people who are the collaborators bringing Jesus here. And there is this questioning of whether or not Jesus is the King of the Jews.
Yeah.
Was this something that was important to you as you
Whoa,
heard growing up?
yes,
Yeah.
and yes, that's, like that sign over the cross,
The
like,
INRI. Yeah.
that is, like King of Jews,
Mhm.
and the mocking of him being King of Jews, but also like, yeah, like Jesus was the King of Jews. So I was very struck with Borg and Crossan's depiction and how they explained what happened there, because I also never looked at, that question, like they basically, like you say you're the King of Jews, they say you're the King of Jews. And what does Jesus say? Like, I love that reply where
Yeah, this is great, right?
yeah,
You say that I am.
Yes,
Could be
and that's really I mean, that again, I keep saying this changes some of the narrative that we grew up with, at least that I grew up with. Um, he doesn't say, like, I
well,
always just
you are the king of the Jews. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and in the mocking tone and even the
Mm,
way that Jesus responds, he's like, "You say that I am," like,
right.
I'm not saying anything
Yeah.
possibly, like, I'm just leaving this vague,
Yeah.
like
I love that. Yeah. Are you the king of the Jews?
right.
You say that I am.
Yeah.
That if we read that as italicized, it
Mhm.
changes what is happening there. And
Yeah.
I think what's really going on here is talking about the messiahship of
Mhm.
Jesus, because as we've discussed before, the
Mhm.
Messiah was supposed to be a warrior king who was going to overthrow the powers that be and reestablish a united kingdom of Israel. That's
Mhm.
what Jesus's people really wanted. They wanted to rule themselves. They didn't want an empire. They had this big long history of empires
Mhm.
ruling them. They had this little break after the Maccabees had
Right.
liberated Israel for a period of almost a century, and then they were ruled by the Romans, and so they wanted somebody to come and overthrow the Roman Empire. And so,
Mhm.
whenever we read in the Gospels this stuff about messiahship, that's
Mhm.
what's really at heart here
Right.
is whether or not people believe that Jesus was going to start a revolution to overthrow the Romans.
Right.
And it seems pretty likely that Jesus' followers might have thought
That
that he was going to do that.
so you're telling me that the word Messiah wasn't like, "Oh, you're gonna come save us from our sins,"
Riding
and
in on a
Jesus
cloud.
right. That this was a physical, like, actual liberation, like, somebody that was
Mhm.
going to free them, and
Yes.
oh,
That's
there
a
you
so
go.
that's a great point, right?
It
Because
is.
they thought that they were going to experience that liberation
Mhm.
in their lifetime.
Mhm.
And when Jesus died and he had not done that,
Mhm.
yet people were claiming that he was the Messiah,
Mhm.
they needed to come up with a way for him to do that.
Mm.
And so that's why the early believers
Mhm.
thought that Jesus was coming back.
Right.
And they were wrong.
Right.
They were
Yeah.
just wrong about that, but it
Right.
wasn't because of anything that Jesus taught,
Mhm.
it was because of their own expectations about what was going to happen. I mean, we could, spend a whole lot of time talking about what happens, whenever we have our own expectations about how
Right.
things are going to
Right.
be, but certainly they did, about Jesus. So,
Mhm.
Barabbas is
Mhm.
also somebody who's important in this narrative, beginning
Yeah.
at this first segment, the 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. segment. So,
Right.
did you know much about Barabbas?
I didn't. I remember learning about it a little bit more in college, in one of my theology classes, but it was nice to read this again
Yeah.
because basically, these are two individuals. So we had Jesus, very nonviolent,
Mhm.
revolutionary, and Barabbas was also a revolutionary, but he had no problem being violent, like
Yeah.
whatever by any means necessary, right?
Yeah.
So I really like that because I think he's also a forgotten character. Like, how
Mhm.
often do we hear anybody talk about Barabbas?
Yeah.
But I think that's a very clear, that Mark included him in there for a reason.
Yes, and I think that distinction that you drew is so important, that Barabbas was not a bandit, but was a freedom fighter
Hmm.
or a terrorist, depending on if
Right.
you are the Jewish people in the first century or if you are Rome.
Hmm.
And the violent revolution, though, is is really describing more about what happened in Mark's time than
Hmm.
Jesus's. And this is where biblical interpretation gets real tricky
Right.
because we read through the story and it can be really tough to determine if what we're reading is history or if what we're reading is interpretation of the author's time. And so
Hmm.
I think the character of Barabbas is likely an invention of Mark to talk
Hmm.
about what is happening at his own time. So, as we read, starting in around 66, there was this revolt against Rome,
Hmm.
And it kind of came to a head in Jerusalem, and it ended up with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And so that is all at play
Mhm.
whenever we're reading these crucifixion narratives, especially in the Gospel of Mark, because it
Mhm.
was happening at the time the Gospel was written. And so I think this is a commentary on the people's choice to use violence, like
Right.
Barabbas, instead of non-violent resistance
Mhm.
like Jesus. And so this whole dramatic scene about who are you going to release? Who do you want to let go? Well,
Right.
we're going to choose Barabbas. We're following Barabbas, right?
Mhm.
That that wasn't a historical thing.
Mhm.
Rome didn't let people off the hook just because they, I don't know, as a gesture of goodwill or something like that.
Right.
This was Rome. That these were revolutionaries.
Right.
If you revolted against Rome,
Mhm.
you
You died.
died.
You died. You didn't have a chance. Right.
And so maybe that is a good point to move to the 9 a.m. time, 9 to
Mhm.
noon. And at this time, Jesus has begun moving towards the cross.
Mhm.
And I don't know about you, but whenever I have pictured Jesus carrying the cross, maybe it's because of movies and stuff, but I have always pictured him like carrying
The
this whole
whole
cross.
cross. Right.
Have
Right.
you had that kind of mental image as well?
Yes, there was only I don't know if it was one movie that I watched or if it was somebody explaining it to me, where I learned that it was most likely just the top part of the
Hmm.
cross. And so I visually I think there was a movie because I visually see it. Um, but yeah, in all our I mean, in all the artwork that we see in movies, whatever, it's the whole thing. But the crosses were permanently placed, like the main
Yeah.
part of the cross were permanently set up, I think as a warning sign.
Yeah.
Probably like, if you mess with us, this is what you can expect.
The
Like
post's already up.
yeah,
It's
exactly.
already
It's
ready.
ready to
Yeah.
go. We just need to add you to this. So
Mhm.
so I think that that was also very important and yeah, very interesting tidbit.
Yeah, I think you're right. The post being right outside the cities. I think especially large cities like Jerusalem,
Mm.
they had the post permanently there, and you
As you walk
all
in.
as you walk in,
Welcome.
I mean, not only might you see a vertical pole that you know is a cross, but you might see people hanging on the
Right,
cross. And so
right.
that was a reminder to people to stay in line. And Rome was
Mhm,
a very efficient empire. And as we've talked about before, there were both good things that
mhm.
came out of Rome,
Right,
uh, and there were bad things that came out of
right.
Rome.
Yeah.
And part of the bad thing was just the nature of imperialism, that
Mhm.
you are a domination system, and as a domination system, you dominate. And so you might see these poles, or you might see people hanging on the cross there.
Yeah.
And we see Jesus then w next to these 2 bandits, right?
Thieves, right? Because that's what I
Thieves,
was told.
bandits, but they're
Very
not.
different. No, the word bandit also, I mean, I eventually learned this, but I
Yeah.
just this is something that is so important because I was taught that, he was up there next to 2 thieves. So, like, people who had robbed or had cheated. No, the word bandits literally, it could be translated, um, and it meant people who had criticized the empire, who stood up against the empire, who were scheming against the empire. So he was with people who, I mean, they weren't thieves. They weren't just common, getting in trouble for, I don't want to say minor,
Yeah.
minor things, but I think this is really important.
It's super important. And this is maybe another important place to say that this is why it's important to recognize the differences between the gospels,
Hmm.
because in Luke we get this dialogue about today you'll be with me in paradise and all this that is not in the gospel of Mark, and I don't
Hmm.
think was the intent.
Hmm.
And so I think, recognizing that is important. So, yeah, so we've got these people who were revolutionaries, but violent
Hmm.
revolutionaries, and so I think it shows us that Jesus was executed as a revolutionary against Rome, but
Yeah.
he was talking about a different kind of revolution. Not a
Mhm.
violent revolution, but a non-violent revolution of the heart, where
Right.
we embodied the values of the reign of God, the realm of God, the kingdom of God.
Mhm.
And so I think that's incredibly important.
Definitely.
So at noon, the darkness
Mhm.
covers the land.
Right. Right.
And do you think there's like a solar eclipse or something?
Well, scientists have said that they don't think so for a bunch of different reasons, and they name that in the book. But no, I always was very moved by that
Yeah.
section growing up and like just reading that because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is really powerful. And it really was God
Yeah.
who, just covered the world in darkness because he's sad or he's, whatever
Yeah.
reasons I gave when I was younger. But, as I've gotten older and as I explain in the book, like very symbolic, very, what does darkness mean?
Yeah.
It could mourning, sadness, and all this other stuff. But it's no, I don't think it actually happened. I think it was a literary touch there.
This is just like in, say, the Gospel of Matthew, where the Magi are following the star. We don't need to get too concerned with looking for uh, actual events where there might have been a star that was larger in the sky or something like that.
Right.
It's symbolic. It's a literary device, just like it would be if we were reading any other narrative or if we were watching
Hmm.
a movie, you know?
Right.
Just
Right.
like rain symbolizes cleansing and purity. Often darkness, it symbolizes something
Hmm.
sad has happened. And so
Right.
that's what happens from noon to 3. At 3 o'clock, we see the curtain in the temple
Hmm.
torn.
Hmm.
And I think that's symbolic as well, both because I think it would be impossible for the temple
Right.
cloth to just get torn.
Right.
But it's also really symbolic. It's a condemnation of the temple
Mhm.
because the the temple curtain was in this place called the Holy of Holies, that was just the most sacred place on earth. And, they believed that God was present everywhere in the same way that we often talk about that today. But God was especially present there, that
Mhm.
God's physical presence was there in some way. And only one person was allowed to go in there, the high priest, and only on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur.
Mhm.
And so that's it. And so that temple curtain being torn, hugely symbolic. And
Right.
so it opens up God's presence to people. But I also think that it's an indictment of the temple.
Mhm.
And perhaps most importantly, I think it is also symbolic of the time in which Mark was written.
Mhm.
Because as I said just a few moments ago, the
Right.
temple was destroyed. So
Right.
it had literally been kind of ripped open, ripped apart.
Mhm.
And to me, this
Mhm.
reminds me of the Babylonian exile.
Okay.
And so this was not the first time
Mhm.
that these folks had been oppressed,
Right.
right? So the Babylonian exile was this point in time where the Babylonian Empire came and they destroyed the temple
Mhm.
in Jerusalem. And during that point, the religion of the ancient Israelites shifted because it was no longer purely temple focused. People were ripped out of their home and stuff. And
Mhm.
so there became synagogues. And so that's the point at which scholars tend to identify Judaism as forming was after
Mhm.
that temple had been destroyed.
Okay.
And so I think this is something very similar that has happened,
Right.
that the temple has once again been destroyed, never to
Mhm.
be rebuilt, at least in these past 2,000 years, and
Right.
it shifted the way
Mhm.
that religion operated. And so in a
Mhm.
very real way, uh, it was like the curtain had been torn
Right.
and like
Okay.
God's presence had been made
Mhm.
made manifest.
Right.
Did
Right.
anything else stick out for you about the curtain being torn? Or
Um,
about the what happened in that period of time, the 3 o'clock?
No, not really, other than, no, I think that was about it, yeah. But I think those are all very powerful statements, and it's super important to recognize that, Mark was writing for a purpose,
Yeah.
and the literary commentary that he's making there. It's not, and it's okay that these
Mm.
things didn't physically happen, we're
Yeah.
still trying to make a point about Jesus's death and those moments and what's
Mm.
happening in current day circumstances. I think is just as important.
That's a great point. That's a fantastic point, though, that it's not it doesn't have to have literally happened
Mhm.
to speak truth about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
In the same way that it's okay if there wasn't really a centurion that
Right.
then proclaimed Jesus as the Son of God,
Right.
because the statement that's being made there is by picking a centurion, someone from the Roman army,
Mhm.
who has a loyalty to Rome,
Yeah.
declare that Jesus is the Son of God.
Mhm.
He's saying loyalty to God over empire. That is a proclamation against Rome that Mark is making, and I think
Right.
is really important.
Yeah.
I also think something else important happens during this 3-hour time span, that you mentioned last week, and that's
Is it
the
the
women.
women?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I think it's very important to recognize who was there. And I think it's also important because I have heard commentaries where they say that women are erased from the Bible, that they didn't.
Mm,
And I think it's important to note that the gospel writers do bring women and mention women in their writings. I think what's
mhm.
been erased has been over history,
Yeah,
what we're teaching in Sunday
yeah.
school classes from the
Mm,
pulpits. That's where
mhm,
we don't
mhm.
always mention the women,
Yeah,
but the gospel writers do, and Mark specifically mentions that the women were still there; they were present during all of this. So yeah, I think that's very, very important, and we don't hear where the male disciples went, specifically the
yeah,
12. That
yeah. We just know they weren't there.
they were not there. And I mean, it is possible. And he does say, like Borg and Crossan do say that possibly there was less risk for the women involved at the time, but that it also speaks to Jesus and his followers and the importance that women had there.
Yeah,
Because in Jewish tradition and also in the Roman Empire, women, again, they weren't first class citizens, like they
yeah,
weren't, they definitely had to, be submit
yeah,
and they didn't have important roles
yeah,
really. So the fact that the women were there and were loyal followers and that he mentions that they helped fund his ministry too. Like I think
yeah.
all of that is really important.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
reminder as they're there, not at the foot of the cross in this gospel because they weren't
Mhm.
allowed there, but that they were the only ones there watching, that they also were the ones who funded the ministry, and they
Right.
remind us of Mark reminds us of that in the narrative.
Yeah.
So I think that's significant, and then at 6 o'clock, Joseph of Arimathea, asked to be able to bury Jesus, which
Mhm.
is not common. But the other thing that we get there is, I think, an important word
Mhm.
in Greek, which is lutron,
Right.
which is translated in many English Bibles as ransom. His life was a ransom for
Mhm.
many, but
Mhm.
Borg and Crossan point out that it was actually a payment for liberation. So a
Right.
means for liberation, which is probably a better translation. So
Mhm.
he gave his life as a means of liberation
Mhm.
for people, which I think
Right.
is extremely significant. So
Yeah.
that's something that we get here at 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
So Marcella, that's a lot.
There's so much. There's still things that we could talk about.
Yes. Yes, we tried to walk through the narrative
Right.
as quickly as we could,
Mhm.
but look, with all of that, there is a ton of embedded theology that the
Mhm.
church has given to us
Yes.
that we really do have to unpack, that we have
Mhm.
to deconstruct a little bit.
Yeah.
And so one of the pieces of this is whether or not God wanted Jesus to die or not.
Right.
Have you ever heard that explanation?
Ooh, a lot. A lot. We hear and we I mean, we hear it all the time.
Mm,
God wanted Jesus to die or needed Jesus to die.
mhm.
Yeah, I don't like it.
I don't like it either, and I think this is tied into 2 of our other suspects. So God is one
Mhm.
of the suspects
Mhm.
because this is an argument that we hear a lot, is that why did Jesus die on the cross? Because God had preordained for Jesus to die on the cross
Right.
because God needed Jesus to die on the cross. And the two reasons that are often given for that are tied into each other and are also two suspects on
Mhm.
our murder board, which are original sin and personal sin.
Okay.
And I think
Alright.
the way the argument usually goes is that in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve messed up and they marred all of humanity with their their mistake. And they ate from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they knew all the things, and God got mad about that, and so they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. And then everybody who had been born from Adam and Eve had that sin, and they were marked by that mistake, and God needed something to make that right,
Mm.
and so needed some kind of sacrifice. And that may mean that that's our own kind of sin that
Mhm.
we have from that, but also our just, like, our own sin and the way we behave. Have you heard that piece, like, our own sin?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely that, we are born with sinful
Mhm.
nature, and because we are not able to stop sinning or whatever,
Yeah.
like, that's why Jesus died for that, so that we can hold on to that in our place and, you know,
Be
live
made
better.
right with
Be made
God.
right, and in some of our traditions, we talk about sanctification, where eventually you can get to that point where
Oh.
you just will not sin ever again.
Oh, that's
Or
interesting. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, it's messy.
Yeah, so I have a lot of problems with this theology.
Same.
But let me just try and spell out what we have to believe if we really buy into this theology. We really buy into it. We have to believe that God created humanity, and the way that God created humanity was imperfect, and so we ended up living out imperfectly
Mhm.
as God had created us to be. And so God then thought we were so bad that God wanted to kill us, and the only way that God could prevent God's self from killing us was to send God's son, who was also kind of God, to die on our behalf so God would kill God's self and God's son in our place so that then we would be made right with God. And to me, that is just ludicrous. I
Yeah.
mean,
There's very little logic to that. I mean, forget some of the but
can
logic about God needing to kill, but it's somewhere in there too. There's God loves us so much that he didn't want to punish all of us. So
yeah,
that's why Jesus also came, but
yeah.
there's just, yeah, it's very messed up. I feel sorry.
And so it is messed up, and and so there is some kind of atoning language in the Bible,
Hmm.
because that was also kind of a part of the system, but
Hmm.
a part of the system that Jesus was confronting, the
Hmm.
temple cult, right? It was a part of
Right.
what Jesus was confronting.
Right.
But we also get a lot of other interpretations in the Bible, and I think this goes back to how we view the Bible. If we wanna try and make everything mesh together,
Hmm.
then we end up with this really messy product,
Yeah.
and the truth is that some of the theologies don't mesh together, and we
Right.
gotta be okay with that.
Yeah.
And so I think we also have to realize that most of this crap theology that we get does not originate with Jesus.
Right. Yes, and I actually had forgotten, that they mentioned where it started too, like, was it Saint Anselm?
Yeah.
Yes, I had totally forgotten those details. I mean, like, there's just so much, and I know that, Constantine threw in his
Yeah.
own touch, and so but that it started with Saint Anselm, how many century or, like, hundreds of
Yeah.
years later?
Yeah.
Or
That's a great point that, like, okay, so original sin was invented by Augustine,
Mhm.
and it was several hundred years after Jesus, 4th or 5th century, I think. And then yeah, Saint Anselm, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury,
Mhm.
um in the 11th century, created this notion of what is actually penal substitutionary atonement. The
Yes.
idea that Jesus died to take our place,
Mhm.
and died for our sins,
Mhm.
that for the first 1,000 years of Christian history, this was not the dominant belief
It
system.
wasn't a part of it
Yeah.
at all, and now it is the dominant belief system.
Yes, so much so that even saying that
Mhm.
Jesus didn't die for our sins is incredibly controversial.
I saw that post on progressive Christianity. I see the
So
comments.
something that I try to say all the time because
Mhm.
I don't think that's authentic to the
Right.
original teachings of Jesus. I
Mhm.
don't think it's good theology, and I think it ends up making us think that we are fundamentally bad.
Right.
And so
Indeed.
a counterpoint to the notion of original sin is the concept of original blessing, which can be
Mhm.
found in the first creation story. So
Mhm.
there are two creation stories, Adam and Eve. There's a second one. First creation story, God goes through and creates every bit of the universe. And after each piece says,
It was good.
it was good
Yeah.
and God was pleased. And so
Yeah.
I think that if we see human nature in that way, I think, human beings are complicated. I don't know that
Yeah.
we're fundamentally good or fundamentally bad, or
Yeah.
I think we're all complicated people,
Yeah.
and it depends on our circumstances. We make good decisions, we make bad decisions. But
Mhm.
I think seeing ourselves as fundamentally affirmed by God
Yeah.
and that we are not a mistake
Yeah.
changes the way that we think about ourselves
Yeah.
and changes the way that we think about life,
Indeed.
and certainly changes the way we think about Jesus's death.
Yeah. Yep. And the way that and they state it so beautifully at the very I think it's the last two lines of the chapter where they clearly say Jesus, we can say that Jesus died because of sin,
Yes.
but not for our sins. And I mean, we
Yes.
can get into that a little bit more later in the
Yeah.
next episode, but I really, really like that.
Yeah.
And again, I feel like this holds so much more power
Yeah.
than just and it empowers us too that we're
Yeah.
beautiful, that we are created good, far more than oh, well, I'm a sinful person. That's why I did that. That's why I hate this person.
Yeah.
It's instead of blaming sin, I
Yeah.
feel like it empowers us to like, I
Yeah.
am a good person and God sees us as beautiful. And
Yeah.
it also changes the way we view God as like
Yeah.
instead of like, not evil, but like mean and like a
Yeah.
punitive God, a very loving God. And it changes the way that we can
Yeah.
see Jesus too and our call
Mm.
as
Mm.
Christians. So it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a
We're
lot.
not sinners in the hands of an angry God
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah.
Instead, we're good in the hands of a loving God.
Yeah.
And I think that is so right, Marcella, that he didn't die for our sins, but he died because of human sin.
Mhm.
Or that he didn't live to die,
Yeah.
but lived his life in such a way that he did die,
Mhm.
speaking truth and love to the principalities and the powers,
Mhm.
to the political domination system, to the religious domination system. Once again, not all Jews, but the religious establishments, the principalities and the powers who were cooperating with Rome
Mhm.
to oppress people,
Mhm.
and it got him killed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's enough for today.
Mhm. It's a lot.
That's a lot.
It is.
Do you wanna go over our new suspects that we got today?
Yes. So our new suspects, well, we just finished talking about one God,
Mhm.
our personal sin and original sin, which are all tied in, like we just talked about. But those are our new suspects. So
Yeah,
yeah, we
and
can.
I mean, I think we addressed a lot of those today because it's just there's so much baggage, but
Yeah.
next week, we're going to conclude this
Yeah.
series
Wow.
because Jesus has now been murdered, but
Hmm.
that's not where the story ends
Hmm.
in the Gospels or in history
Right.
because we are continuing to talk about Jesus and what that means. So I think next week we'll come back and we'll talk about who we think is really responsible for
Awesome.
Jesus's death. We'll land somewhere on that and
Hmm.
we'll invite those who have been listening to land somewhere on that as well. And
Hmm.
we'll talk about the events of Silent Saturday
Mm.
and Easter Sunday.
Yes.
We hope you can join us next time for our final episode of Who Killed Jesus?